Here we go. Japanese history. Let's see if I can do this without getting into too much trouble. We're going to do 20,000 years in 20 minutes. So you'll understand if I skip a few things, doing an average of 1,000 years per minute. Okay? Hopefully this history gets you interested in certain areas about the country, and you'll look a little deeper on your own. Alright? We're going to cover these 5 topics, roughly. Which is older, Japan or China? Probably you know this answer. Which countries have influenced Japan the most? And here's a hint, it's connected to question number 1. For 3, if you ask Japanese people, what do they think are the most popular or interesting phases of the history? We'll look at those 2 in a little bit of detail. When did Japan modernize? In this case, modernize I mean industrialize, or start to take the technologies created by the Industrial Revolution. The last one, what is the Japanese miracle? Or another way it has been called is the economic animal, but maybe that's not very nice. Alright, China or Japan? Which one's older? It kind of depends on how you define China or how you define Japan. Let's look at a legendary definition of Japan, which is the Emperor Jimmu Tenno. Tenno means emperor. Yeah, this was a great guy. He lived to be, 130 years old? So he was pretty tough. He's described thousands of years after he was dead in Japan's oldest books. And so that means he must have had a lot of power, right? And influence. Well, it may be a fantastical story, but it's useful and was actually promoted in a Japanese modernization period as the truth for a foundational figure. Kind of like China's foundational yellow emperor. If we base the countries on this interpretation, China is much older than Japan by roughly 2,000 years. We can say the yellow emperor came somewhere around 2,500 or 2,600 BCE. When I say BCE, I just mean BC. It's kind of a new way to talk. It means before the Common Era. And right now we are in the Common Era, CE. Here's another way to judge a country's age. When do you first start to see a culture which we can measure and touch? So pottery is a nice way to judge that. For a long time, people said that Jomon pottery was the oldest in the world. The Jomon people were the indigenous Japanese, or I should say, one of the groups of indigenous Japanese. Now this is an interesting culture which continued for about the longest period of time which I know of. They seem to have found harmony with nature. In harmony, what I mean is they didn't destroy the land so much that they had to run away. They had very light agricultural practices. Also, if you're not connected to that Asian mainland, you don't have to worry too much about invasion. So this was a very robust and stable culture, it looks like. 13,000 BCE? Man, oldest in the world, right? Sorry, Japan. You can't say that anymore. China has you beat. Recent archaeological work in China seems to say that China developed pottery somewhere around 3,000 years before Jomon. Now, there was a major shift in the Japanese population from the Jomon, which ended sometime around 300 years before the Common Era. And it shifts when rice came to the mainland Japan. And I should say wet rice cultivation. The rice paddy farming came via Korea. Korea is probably the closest way that mainland Asia connects to Japan. These people are called Yayoi now. And we can tell now by skeletal comparisons with morphology and now DNA that the Yayoi people have some distinct physiology from the Jomon. So it seems to suggest that the Jomon population was displaced or intermixed with the Yayoi people. This is sometime around 300 BCE. Now, where did the Yayoi come from and who are they? The simple answer, which some Japanese people may be angry to hear me say, is they were Koreans. And in fact, a 2012 paper from a Japanese university, Seoul Kendai, suggests that modern Japanese DNA is really quite mixed with mainland Asian population, Jomon population, and Ryukyuan population, the Ryukyu people coming from modern-day Okinawa. So that suggests that rice paddy farming became very influential, but not necessarily accompanied by war. Of course, it's hard to know what really happened. By 57 CE, we start to get records in mainland China talking about the Wa people. And so somehow they became important enough to be talked about. And now these days, the word Wa is sometimes used to talk about Japanese. So for example, Japanese food is called Wa-shoku. Wa, Japanese, shoku, food. There you go. The real big change happened around, we can take the official date of 538, if you would like, when Buddhism came to Japan. And we can start to maybe call this the first real state of Japan. By 600, we have some great architecture, which continues on. We could see this as a combination of centralized power, having political organization, mixing with religious power. There are also examples of bridges existing from the 700s in Japan until today. Of course, this is not the original building of Horyuji. Pieces of it have been exchanged, pieces of it have burned down. Japan has always had trouble with fire. Of course, everything is built of wood. So, who influences Japan the most? I think I kind of hinted to you already, but if we see this graphic, we suggest Korea and China. But I want to say at this time, Korea was, of course, influenced by China themselves. So ultimately, the influence comes from China. This is religion, government, writing, music. Try to read it if you can. This is sheet music from 738. Yeah, that's from China. All of early Japanese literature was written in Chinese, and it took somewhere around 100 years for Japan to get some original Japanese documents. And that happened in the 700s again. So that's really a critical period for Japan. There is another type of influence which still affects the Japanese mindset today, and that is the size of Asia and the ability of cultural and, of course, military dominance from Asia. Now, I think Japanese appreciate the contribution of writing from China, but they still want to keep some degree of independence and uniqueness. So there's a really famous story which is quite powerful in the Japanese mind now, and it gives us the word kamikaze, which actually means the divine wind. So Japan was going to be invaded by Kublai Khan. After Kublai Khan had conquered China, his Mongolian army had conquered China, they were ready to take Japan. It should be easy, yes? Japan is tiny compared to China. And they tried twice, and somehow, both times, a great typhoon in the Japan Sea washed all the boats away, and there was barely any fighting on the Japanese mainland, and the fighting that did happen seems to have been great Japanese victories. So this is a great story of Japan resisting the military influence of the mainland China. Even though this happened more than 700 years ago, I would argue that there is still a sense of insecurity that runs through the Japanese mindset when they think about the relative size of their country and mainland Asia. This, of course, will come up in the history again. What are the two most popular or talked about time periods in Japan? I asked my colleagues before I did this lecture, but actually I had already chosen the subject, so I'm glad their answers matched with my ideas. The first to talk about is the Heian Period. So after that initial formation of centralized government and so on, it took a few hundred years to get going. By 794, that's the official date anyway, Japan had a very structured and strong central government in Kyoto. So Kyoto, I think they call that the eternal capital, don't they? It would be the capital of Japan for almost 1,000 years. This saw the rise of two of the most endearing Japanese icons. One is the samurai. The samurai rose up as a feudal class of protectors for their lords, and they were near the top of the social hierarchy. We also started to get the great literature, which defines part of the Japanese consciousness. It has been said by somebody that the Tale of Genji is the world's first novel. I don't know how to define a novel, but being written around the year 1000, the Tale of Genji is a very unique look into the personal mind. It's not just a tale of, actually a rather naughty and bad, poorly behaved man called Genji. It's not just his story of going around and sleeping with women and killing people. There is that, but there's also his thought process. He doesn't always feel good about it. And that is supposed to be new or somewhat unique in world history. And it's very interesting because it was written by a woman, by a court woman who was in the emperor's court in Kyoto. What's the next most famous part of Japanese history? The Edo Period. I think this is the biggest. If you talk to young people or older people, there's almost a nostalgia for the Edo Period. And it might actually be because this is also called the closed period, or the closed country. During this period, Japan was mostly closed off to world trade and world affairs. But this is also marking a few more of major milestones that create the Japanese character, such as moving the political capital to Edo, now called Tokyo. We got a lot of the cultural elements that we recognize. Geisha, kabuki, and certain other types of theater, these wood block prints This one in here is by a guy called Hokusai, who's probably the best well-known. Haiku became quite well-known at this time. And I think beyond these, it's the ability for Japan to develop a culture which is not very influenced by China. In fact, at the beginning of this period, China was experiencing a major shift in its policy. Ming China would collapse in the early part of the Edo period. And it probably led to Japan starting to feel a sense of greatness, of the ability to do things by themselves. And indeed, in terms of food and clothing and the necessities of life, they were self-sufficient. They traded on their own terms with China and a little bit with Eastern Russia. And the only Western European country which they traded with was the Dutch. Final thing to include here is a beautiful picture of kabuki. Look at that. This is, of course, towards the end of the Edo period, but we might also say that the sense of Japanese society started to develop in the Edo period. Probably this is the time when you could actually gather many people together and different classes had some form of interaction. Although we have to remind ourselves that this is a minority and the majority of people are still poor peasants farming on land without many rights. Hey, that leads me to my next point. When did Japan modernize? Well, yeah, after the Edo period. You can guess that by now, right? It was kicked off by the arrival of Matthew Perry's black ships in 1853 and 1854, which forced Japan open under the threat of force. These great steam ships, they call them the black ships because of the smoke that would come from the steam engines on these boats. Japan hadn't seen these before, or hadn't much experience with these before. They were actually not allowed to build ocean-going ships at this time. So it apparently made quite an impression on Japanese. Perry even didn't just threaten Japan, but he also tried to overwhelm them with some of the technology. He apparently brought a mini train with tracks to set up to show Japanese the magical power they had. And I would argue that was a smart move. Japanese like gadgets, and they're very interested in getting some of the latest technology, which they do adapt and use for their own purposes. Very soon after that, the rail system in Japan developed incredibly quickly after this. Now, we have to say that Perry did not open Japan. It's not, of course, that simple. This was the fourth expedition of America to open Japan. And it didn't succeed before that because the Tokugawa state was comfortable and powerful. By the 1850s, relations on the world stage were changing, and the relative power of the United States was certainly growing larger than that of Japan. So after 250 years, it's not surprising that Japan needed a sort of political shake-up, and that it was time for the Tokugawa period to end. Bring in the Meiji era. An incredible instance of a top-down revolution. So, again, please look that up. Look up names like Sakamoto Ryoma or Saigo Takamori. They have very interesting stories of the conflict between the ruling class and the Tokugawa government, which was starting to fall down. One of the solutions was to put all the hopes on the emperor, who really was a figurehead, but became a very powerful tool for Japanese elites and bureaucrats to use to further their goals. This is just incredible industrialization in such a quick time. However, there's a dark side, isn't there? Just as the Europeans did after industrialization, Japan started invading other countries. It's a long debate. Why did they do it? At least I have to give one point of view, that it was defensive. If Japan did not secure more bases for industrial development, then they would be vulnerable to attack from the Europeans. I'm sure this is true. And on the other side, there's the case that just pure expansionism, the Japanese desire to take more lands and to conquer. And again, if we are being governed by samurai, there must be some truth in this as well. But I'm going to step away from that debate for the minute, and also for the next section. That's your challenge, to look up that debate by yourself. But however, we have to say, there was invasions of the Ryukyu Kingdom, which is Okinawa. They took all of Hokkaido from the Ainu. They took Taiwan. They took Korea, parts of Russia, parts of China. All of this within a 25-year period. It's incredible. And it shocked the other industrialized countries when Japan defeated Russia. And I mean really defeated them completely in naval battles and a bit of ground battles in 1905. Well, that's the Meiji. Now we're going to get to the toughest part to talk about, because this starts to enter historical memory. To talk about the Japanese miracle, we have to talk about the period before that. And this is all included in the Showa period. Emperor Showa, he saw so much in his life. In America, we usually call him Hirohito. It's the same person. In the imperial period, this is really quite different from the state period which followed. So how do I talk about this? The fact is, Japan took large parts of China, and before they started to lose in the Pacific War, they had taken so much of Southeast Asia. The idea was to create this greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, which was, it was called a bloc of Asian nations led by the Japanese and free of Western powers. And so, I believe them when they say this. I think there was some cultural superiority complex going on, certainly. A lot of the documents you read from this period are very racialized, thinking that Japan was perhaps the best race in Asia. So there's a very paternalistic point of view here. But if we connect it to other historical themes of insecurity, the Japanese felt themselves to be a small and vulnerable country, and rather than wait to be attacked by somebody else, they attacked first. And I do believe them when they say they wanted to create an Asia for the Asians, to keep the Western influence out. Because there's a very clear historical precedent of keeping the Western powers out. And there's a lot of logic to do that. The means of doing it, that's for you guys to debate. After World War II, Japan was devastated. Devastated. There's a heavy book to read on this called Embracing Defeat. It's incredible how low the country was for 10 years. But somehow, from that period, 1955 on, it's an incredible story. And this is what they call the Japanese miracle. By the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, they had built this Shinkansen bullet train. They had built the Tokyo Tower. They were on pace to become the third and then second largest economy in the world by the 1970s. Incredible stories all around, I have to tell you. I don't mean to put moral judgment on this, but just from historical interest, the country is so full of fascinating stories. So check it out, please, and tell me what you think about it.